Good evening and welcome to the in-person and virtual town hall meeting here at Georgetown Public Library. This is a meeting to discuss the proposed Sexual Harassment Bill 2023. I'm Shanda Gallego, your moderator for this evening's meeting, and I would like to welcome each and every one of you in person and those that are tuning in online on our CIGTV, YouTube, and Facebook channels. We will get right into it with an overview of the proposed Sexual Harassment Bill 2023, the draft bill, and I would like to welcome the Gender Affairs Unit's Senior Policy Analyst, Ms. Carleen Bramwell.
And thank you again for coming out tonight. And I hope that this presentation will be informative and you will find it interesting and that it answers some of the questions that you may have. So the Sexual Harassment Bill 2023, as a standalone piece of legislation, seeks to make available an explicit law and procedures to aid victims, ensure perpetrators are held accountable, and to generally address the societal problem, which can limit a person's ability to feel safe, secure, and productive while navigating their tasks and activities of daily life. It must be noted that there are other pieces of legislation which include sexual harassment in it, but the distinction is that this particular bill is only about sexual harassment, and it goes into details as to how it can be dealt with within certain circumstances. So the bill seeks to prevent sexual harassment by providing specific requirements for a variety of entities to put in place policies and procedures to deter sexual harassment and for dealing with such conduct. In addition, it provides a process and legal remedies in circumstances where a person makes a sexual harassment complaint. Sexual harassment is unwanted or unwelcomed behavior of a sexual nature that is offensive, humiliating, or intimidating, or that creates a hostile environment. The conduct can be verbal, it can be physical, it can be by gesticulation, it may be subtle, it may be direct, it can occur in person, face-to-face, electronic, etc. Anyone can experience sexual harassment regardless of their gender, sex, social status, age, or other personal characteristic. So examples of sexual harassment include making a joke about sexual acts with a person, sending sexual images, graphics, or audio to a person, commenting on a parent's appearance, body parts, or figure, repeatedly asking a coworker for a date, especially when the person has already told you no, offering or requesting a job promotion in exchange for a sexual favor, and any sexual conduct which is unwelcomed. And it's important to emphasize that point about unwelcomed behavior. Of course, this list is not exhaustive, but those are just a few examples. So in general, sexual harassment is a pervasive global, regional, and community issue. We have heard a lot about it over the last couple of years particularly, and it affects both males and females. It has significant psychological, social, and economic consequences. Dr. Bodden, who is here this evening, will talk about some of those psychological consequences. It is discriminatory, prohibited, illegal, and a violation of persons' rights. I'll just bring your attention to some of the facts that we have. These are global statistics, not necessarily Cayman, but we do know from surveys that have taken place here that many of these actually also relate to Cayman. So 1 in 4 women have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. 1 in 10 men have also experienced sexual harassment. 25% of men are concerned about being falsely accused of sexual harassment, and we know that that has been a concern sort of voiced by a number of persons. So the proposed bill protects all persons living, visiting, or working in the Cayman Islands. In particular, it places specific responsibilities on employers and employees, institutions, members of qualifying bodies, associations, charitable and non-for-profit organizations, employment agencies, persons involved in the transaction of goods and services, and landlords and tenants, and of course, any third party to the aforementioned. So basically, you can see that all sections of society will be impacted by this bill. The key characteristics of the bill. It provides a definition and examples of conduct and circumstances which would constitute sexual harassment. It requires every employer, regardless of the size of the company, to formulate a policy statement. It prohibits employers and employees from committing acts of sexual harassment. It outlines the employer and employee obligations and duty, and it imposes sexual harassment liability on an employer under certain circumstances. In addition, it requires institutions to have a policy to protect employees, students, children, residents, or clients. It prohibits sexual harassment in the provision of accommodation, goods, services, or facilities, including landlord and tenant transactions. And it requires different bodies to also have a policy. So there is also a sample sexual harassment policy attached to the bill. So we're not expecting people to go out and just make up their own. We have actually assisted by providing a sample, which can then be adopted. The bill also provides a procedure to make complaints of sexual harassment to the Gender Equality Tribunal. And that tribunal will do the hearing and resolution of such complaints, including orders and costs that may be imposed. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. It prohibits victimization of a person as a result of making a complaint, that there is protection for the victim there. And it provides confidentiality and a limitation on publication of details pertaining to cases appearing before the tribunal. Employer responsibility. All employers, regardless of the size of the business, will be required to issue a sexual harassment policy to their employees. The proposed bill, as I said, has an attached schedule that can be used to make that policy. And there will be an appropriate period to allow for preparation and formulation of policies before the commencement of this act. So again, we would not be expecting businesses to, have a policy tomorrow if we started the commencement of the act today. There will be a period of time that will be given by the government to make sure that people can be in compliance with the act. So another question that has come up repeatedly is if street harassment or public harassment is covered. The bill does not apply to street or public harassment, although we do recognize that this is a concern, but it prohibits a person offering a service or good to members of the public to sexually harass a customer or client. The bill seeks to protect persons by creating a safe workspace and anywhere where services are offered and received by segments of the public. This includes institutions, residential and business accommodations, and facilities, such as places providing financial services, recreation, entertainment, food, transport, care services, religious activities, etc. So the question again could be asked, but what about just joking? Is that sexual harassment? Now, sexual harassment involves changes to cultural and social norms. And in the Caribbean, we know that there are many of those sort of norms that have stood time and time and time again. but there is a chance to change these. Sexual harassment encompasses a wide range of inappropriate, unwelcome, and unwanted conduct or acts. If the joke is of a sexual nature, it can be considered sexual harassment. While it is possible that the person who is being accused of sexual harassment may intend for their conduct to be taken as a joke, this is not enough to preclude them from impeding on the rights of another person. So hence, yes, joking can be considered sexual harassment. So some fears and myths that people have had is about the misuse of the act. The provisions are designed to discourage and prevent the misuse of the act, and I'll talk about one of those later on as well. There is victim protection, and there is that confidentiality. I know that the fear of the lack of confidentiality is one of those things that concern persons, but the publication of details pertaining to cases are limited, and breaches are subject to a penalty. The complaints procedure is as follows. The complaints will be investigated by officers of the Department of Labor and Pensions, and a report will be compiled, and that will be submitted to the Gender Equality Tribunal. The tribunal can compel the provision of documents and other information from any person who the tribunal has reasonable grounds to believe can assist in making a determination on the case. The Gender Equality Tribunal is a quasi-judicial body which can conduct a hearing and make legal orders. However, it is important to note that all internal mechanisms for resolving a claim must first be exhausted before submitting a complaint to the tribunal. So it is expected that the person who has a complaint would have gone through the mechanisms within their company and gotten, well, some sort of resolution. If they're not happy with that resolution, then they can then make a claim to the tribunal. Complaints made on behalf of a person other than the individual who is alleged to be the victim of sexual harassment must have the consent of the alleged victim. And the time period for complaints is 18 months from the alleged incident of harassment. The findings of the tribunal. So the tribunal may stipulate that the complainant's allegations are substantiated or unsubstantiated. The tribunal also has the option of dismissing the complaint under certain circumstances. The tribunal can make an order or declaration that may be appropriate having regard to all the circumstances surrounding the complaint. For example, the respondent can be ordered to not repeat or continue the behavior, or to perform any reasonable act or course of conduct to redress any loss or damage suffered to the complainant. Another order that the tribunal can make is the respondent can be ordered to pay damages to the complainant by way of compensation up to $20,000. These are just a few of the orders that the tribunal has at its disposal. The tribunal may decide against commencing proceedings or may discontinue proceedings if the complaint is assessed and found to be frivolous, misconceived, lacking in substance, or vexatious. So the complainant in that case can be ordered to pay the cost incurred by the tribunal and those of the respondent up to $10,000. So this is one of the ways in which the bill discourages the misuse of its provisions. And a person who fails to comply with an order of the tribunal commits an offense and is liable on summary conviction to a fine of $5,000 or imprisonment for a term of 1 year or both. We have had some feedback on the bill already, and under consideration at the moment are minor amendments to definitions to add clarity, removal of educational institutions from the bill because we believe that some of this might be covered in anti-bullying legislation, which is also being formulated. There are a number of clauses that we may also amend based on the feedback that has been received so far. And organizations and associations have been combined as one section, for example. And a penalty has been added for non-compliance with the requirement for all entities to have a sexual harassment policy and not just for employers. So in March of 2023, a white paper was issued and a period of public consultation was open until the 15th of April. From that consultation period, we got over 300 individuals and organizations which provided feedback. The respondents included both male and female persons. Maybe naturally, there were a lot more female respondents than males, because we do know that this is an issue that has affected females more so than males in many places, or at least the reported instances. The summary of the key findings from the survey. Sexual harassment is seen as a major issue in Cayman. Again, we know this from reports and surveys that have been done from 2006. And it warrants a specific law because it would encourage employers and others to take responsibility to address it. There was low awareness, unfortunately, of any existing related legislation, so we still have some work to do with regards to that, because as I said before, the Gender Equality Law 2011 actually covers sexual harassment. There is strong support for the proposed act. However, many in the responses said that the sexual harassment should include that which is conducted in public spaces, bars, clubs, public transport, and social media. Other persons in the feedback also suggested that they felt that the penalties were too low, should actually be higher, and also that it should be a criminal offense. Respondents were somewhat divided on whether employers should be held responsible for sexual harassment in the workplace, and there was low confidence that employers would be able to resolve sexual harassment disputes among employees. So that may show a need for some training, etc., and other supports. So the bill is now in its second round of public consultation. This particular phase will end on the 8th of September, and then the bill will be brought to Parliament. Once it is finalized by the Cayman Islands Parliament and becomes legislation, then there will be a period of time that is given to affected entities to get themselves essentially in order before the commencement date. You are invited to provide your feedback by going to gov.ky sexual harassment, and the feedback will be used to improve and clarify concepts, procedures, and the provisions of the bill. And we encourage persons also here tonight to give your feedback, whether online or in person. We do encourage that. Thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for being here this evening. And the bill, as I said, can be found on gov.ky/sexual harassment. And if there are any further questions or if you would like to provide further feedback, you can email genderequality@gov.ky. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Bramwell, for providing the overview of the draft bill. At this time, we move along to a panel discussion, and we would also like to remind our listeners and viewers that you can submit your questions online. We are monitoring the space just to make sure that if you have any questions, we'll address it tonight. As well as those in person, we have a roaming mic. Should you have a burning question, please don't be afraid to indicate by way of hand, and we will come to you and address those questions at the convenient time. So the panel discussion, we would like to welcome once again our Senior Policy Analyst in the Gender Affairs Unit. If I'm going too fast, please, time to slow down. Ms. Carleen Bramwell. We also have with us our DCO in the portfolio of Civil Service, Ms. Lauren Knight. Welcome to you. We also have psychologist, a small business owner, and a Business and Professional Women's Club member, Ms. Alexandra Bodden. Welcome to you. And at this time, the panel discussion.
I'll invite Lauren Knight to give a few words on the policy which the government actually has.
Good evening, and thank you for having me. As Ms. Gallego said, my name is Lauren Knight. I'm the Deputy Chief Officer within the portfolio of the Civil Service, and my primary role on this panel tonight is to talk to you about the Cayman Islands government's anti-bullying, harassment, and discrimination policy. I will start off by giving a little history. Initially, when the Civil Service implemented a policy, we had a bespoke sexual harassment policy that was implemented in 2016. And that policy served the organization for 4 years. When there was an opportunity to review that policy, the decision was taken to implement a more comprehensive policy. So our sexual harassment policy actually rolled up into a more comprehensive policy, which is now called the Anti-Bullying, Harassment, and Discrimination Policy. The second word in the name of that policy title, harassment, includes sexual harassment, but we decided to expand it to include other forms of harassment as well, and also to put mechanisms in place for civil servants to report instances of discrimination as well as bullying. So we have an overarching policy that puts provisions in place for civil servants to report any of these types of issues. So the question is why? Why did the civil service feel the need to put this policy in place? Well, the answer to that is quite simple. We've made a commitment to be an employer who cares. And one of the ways that we can demonstrate that we care is by putting these types of policies in place to show our employees that we take these things seriously and to have mechanisms in place for them to report any alleged wrongdoing that may be done against them. So in 2020, July to be exact, we rolled out what I'm going to refer to as the ABH&D policy, anti-bullying, harassment, discrimination. We rolled out the ABH&D policy, and it has been in place ever since. Our policy, in my view, is quite a strong policy. Naturally, I would say that as the author of the policy. But I feel it is a robust policy, and I'll speak to the process momentarily that we went through to develop the policy. But similar to many of the things that Ms. Bramwell shared earlier, we have very strong statements in our policy that talk about what we will and will not tolerate. We outline the expected behaviors of all civil servants, as well as we define very clearly the roles of certain individuals within the organization and the expectations. So in terms of our purpose statement, we specifically say that the purpose of our policy is to define and provide examples of bullying, harassment, and discrimination, reinforce appropriate behaviors that are expected within the workplace, outline the responsibility of employees, managers, and supervisors, human resources, and other individuals that are possibly involved in BH&D, whether they are the victims or witnesses. And the policy, most importantly, provides a framework and guidance for employees to aid in identifying, handling, reporting, and resolving alleged occurrences of BH&D in the workplace. We have defined what each of those things mean, and we've provided very specific examples of what might constitute BH&D. We went a step further and defined what does not constitute BH&D, because as some employers might be aware, certain standard managerial actions are sometimes misinterpreted as bullying. So we felt it very important to also specify what, in our view, we do not consider to be BH&D activities. Contained in our policy, we have 14 very strong policy statements, and these include things like saying that our senior management team is committed to establishing and maintaining an environment where BH&D is not condoned. It goes on to speak about the responsibility of all employees, specifically stating that all employees, regardless of their position or title, are expected to play a role in preventing and identifying cases of BH&D, and further states that prevention is most easily achieved by each employee if they conduct themselves in a manner consistent with the CIG's Code of Conduct and Values. Similar to what Ms. Bramwell said, we also explain in this policy that complainants are required to make their complaints in good faith. Otherwise, complaints are not meant to be vexatious or malicious. And similar to one of the final statements she made, we also have provisions for disciplining those persons who make malicious or vexatious complaints. So where we find that a complaint was not submitted in good faith, we have mechanisms to address that as well. In terms of the process that we went through to build out this policy, initially it started with research, and we looked heavily to the UK to see what they had done in terms of policy in this area. Specifically, we leaned on the CIPD, the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and we looked at some sample materials that they had. With that, we began drafting the policy. Then we entered into a consultation season, similar to what is being done right now. And we consulted with a number of key stakeholders, including HR professionals across the civil service, and we took on board their feedback and advice. Once we had made all of those changes, the policy went to our senior management team for their input. And once that input was taken into consideration, it was time to implement the policy. The policy went live on the 29th of July, 2020, and has been going strong ever since. In terms of the benefits of having this type of policy in place, I believe that goes without saying, but I believe they brought me here to say, so I will say, obviously, when you have these types of policies in place within your governance structure, it sets a very strong tone at the top. It signals to employees that management take them and their needs very seriously. And it indicates that we have methods in place to address any issues that may pop up in the workplace, which frankly happens from time to time. As regrettable as it may be, it does happen. So it sends a very strong message to the employees that we are, in fact, an employer that cares, and that they do have a way to report any alleged instances of bullying, harassment, and discrimination. And going back to some of our firm policy statements, one of those as well talks about retaliation. So it gives employees confidence that they can report these things and not have to worry about things like retaliation, which frankly a lot of people worry about when they start considering, whether they should make a complaint or not. So in a nutshell, those are the benefits that having these types of policies, those are the benefits that are derived when you put these types of policies in place. And I think I will end there, Ms. Carleen, unless you have any specific questions.
Thank you, Lauren. So as I said before, the government has actually put in place such policies. So we're not asking the business community to do anything that we have not done. We're all about the safety of our employees. Lexi, we're going to ask Dr. Alexandra Bodden also to make some comments. As a small business owner and a psychologist, I'm sure that she has also seen the impact of sexual harassment and the importance.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Carleen, for inviting me here today. I'm honored to be a part of this process and really appreciate anyone that's joined in person or online today. So being a member of something that is near and dear to my heart, it was something that was started initially about 16 years ago by the Young Business Professional Women's Club. So the women under 35 in our club started this. And so, and looking back on the reports, it was really interesting. Anyone who's met me knows I love Cayman statistics. That's why you see me peeking over to trying to look at Ms. Carleen's slides. And what they actually found, and this was back in 2006, was 42% of the approximately 900 persons that took their survey reported experiencing some level of sexual harassment. So that's about 2 in 5. So that gave evidence that this is something that's here and definitely something that needs to be looked at within the community. And of course, as times have progressed and we've become more diverse as a community, that's where having legislation and guidance around these kinds of difficulties are so important. It's important to begin to set a framework for understanding, identifying, and addressing sexual harassment in the workplace and in the community. With having such a diverse community and so many different people from different backgrounds, it's really helpful to have in black and white what is, and as Ms. Lauren said, what is not sexual harassment. It begins to codify it, begin to give us black and white guidance on what is not, as well as ways of being able to move forward as well. When it comes to what Ms. Carleen had said about it just being a joke, what I think is really important to understand here is that it's not just about the joke. It's about being a part of a workplace or a community or an organization that allows these kinds of jokes to undermine individuals to take place. It's being a part of a community that sees it as a joke when it's something that dehumanizes or criticizes or belittles another member of the community. So really, it's not just about that one incident. It's about the much bigger picture, which I think is really important to take into consideration with this. So in moving forward with legislation, a lot of times people think it's just a policy. And I think what's really important is to understand how social changes begin to happen. This is something that we work at tirelessly in the gender violence area. But knowing that this is the first step of beginning to make changes, a very important one, but the first step of beginning to have a greater cultural shift to affect attitudes. So in looking at the impact of sexual harassment and that it has on people, and I'm glad that government has included bullying as well. I think workplace bullying is a huge topic because it doesn't have the sexual harassment nature. It doesn't sound as womanish. And so I think it's actually taken up a lot more traction, but it's important to know that sexual harassment is a part of that, right? And it's gonna be anything of a sexual nature. So in this way, it does affect women a lot more, but women can experience difficulties with self-esteem, self-confidence, their ability to trust others around them. We often see a higher incidence of not only stress and distress, but also anxiety and depression. We see this not only in the short term when it's first experienced, but longer term as well. There's going to be longer term rates of depression as these kinds of patterns take place, and especially as there's a cumulative effect on the person involved. So it's important to realize that there's a huge mental health toll that is taken. And as that affects the person, it also affects the people around them. So it's not only going to be that one person affected, but the people around them in the organization and the people that are close to them outside of it as well. With repeated harassment, what we see is a lot of physical effects as well. So there might be actual physical injury, generally not, but there may be. But you often see persons living in this kind of really toxic environment. As I said, the concern is more the environment and that is allowing these kinds of behaviors to take place. It takes a toll on everyone within it. So what we see over time is we see difficulties with blood pressure, increased incidence of obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, some cancers. and a lot of just kind of the general stress things. So people show up on my doorstep with stomach aches, headaches, migraines, a lot of things that come from just being in this constant state of fight or flight, from being concerned about when the next attack or incident may come, or not just being comfortable and safe in the place where you are every day. It's amazing how much time we spend at work and in associations, and especially the institutions that, that might be where people are living. So there's going to be physical and mental health impacts on the person. It also takes a toll on the organizations and the companies that it's happening in. So in one of the studies I looked up, 1 in 4 people said they were sexually harassed in the workplace in the last 5 years, had negative impacts on their employment and career as a result of it. And so persons who experience sexual harassment may use sick leave and annual leave to avoid harassers in the workplace. They'll start avoiding social situations and activities that could have been used to build social networks and career progression. And they may ultimately leave either their workplace and or the field. You know, in Cayman, some career fields are very small, so that may mean they actually change careers because of it. So it's important to realize not only the loss of productivity from that person, but ultimately the loss of productivity overall. So absenteeism is a big direct impact on productivity for the company. This may lower performance, as there's low morale, because places where it's okay to belittle and criticize others is not somewhere where people want to be. You know, and so in that way, you're not going to be engaged, you're not going to be productive, you're not going to be, you know, all that you can be. We talk about the importance of diversity in teams by allowing each person to shine and show their strengths. But as soon as they begin to get shut down, you're automatically losing the direct influence, and then that person's contribution over time as well. There's going to be high employee turnover, which means there's going to be costs of recruiting and training, and low morale, and possibly even legal costs that the business must go through in order to deal with this. In addition to the healthcare costs from a lot of the chronic difficulties that arise from this. So when these things happen, especially in Cayman, where we don't really talk about mental health things, people really do show up at my office as a psychologist just because they're having stomach aches, right? And a lot of times because we don't conceptualize bullying as a trauma, you know, they think they're going crazy or their body's falling apart, and they don't understand the connection between what's happening at work or what's happening in their organization with what's happening in their mind and body at the time. So when you're not able to talk about things and process things emotionally or verbally, we get somatic symptoms. So that's far more common in Cayman. So we're seeing a lot more of the body effects and the physical health difficulties here. So with that, then they'll be accessing healthcare as well. So it's important to look at not only the impact on the person, but also on the companies, which is why it's important that we're able to begin to make some changes to prevent a lot of these difficulties from happening. What I thought was interesting is that there's been some studies that have looked at productivity loss from sexual harassment, estimating it as high as $2.6 billion. And that's going to cover everything from the negative impacts on well-being, lost income as a result of taking unpaid leave, or a period of unemployment, and costs associated with accessing health and the justice systems because of sexual harassment. So, and that doesn't look at long-term, that's looking only at the direct cost. So it's important to know that this is something that does affect everyone. Even if we're not the ones doing it, we've not directly experienced it, although I would venture to say many of us have, even if we've not conceptualized it as sexual harassment. And so that's why it's important for all of us to take a step towards beginning to look at this bill and beginning to take steps in our everyday lives to begin to make changes. The importance of this legislation is huge. As I said, it is just the first step, but it is the first step. And so we need to see if we can make this as effective and practical for everyone as we can. So I encourage everyone to have a look through it. I love I was telling Ms. Carlene, I think on first glance, they've covered everything I could think of. I will continue to look and provide feedback, as I encourage everyone else to as well. But it's the first steps of providing a tangible framework for understanding what sexual harassment is. It provides accountability for everyone, right? So it gives the persons who experience it a way of accessing support. For companies as well, it gives us a way of being able to have a plan. When these things come up, what is sexual harassment? What will I do at that time, right? It's never helpful to do things after the fact. So if we can make a plan and have a process in place, and that's what's going to be most helpful, which ultimately will help with liability as well. So that way, even if things don't go as planned, and you do end up at the Gender Equality Tribunal, you've got a clear plan of this is what happened, this is what we did, And this is what we did, and this is how we address the concerns. That way it provides protection, hopefully for the persons, but also for the company too. So it really is in everyone's interest. It provides a framework for safety and respect. Ultimately, that's what it comes down to. When I say this is the first step, this is often how change comes about within especially diverse societies, where it starts with codified laws and ways of preventing the negative discriminatory behaviors from happening. It compels us to change our behaviors, which hopefully then will help to change attitudes so that hopefully, ultimately, we'll have a much safer and more respectful community for everyone that respects everyone's rights. It will, as people are able to be safer and more engaged, they're going to be more productive, and it will help to not only make the workplace better for them, it also helps protect the reputation of the company as well. Happy employees are more productive and will share about what's going on. Likewise, if things are not good, they will share, especially in Cayman, so it helps protect the reputation of the company. And it's going to be important for all of us to provide feedback on what has worked, especially companies like government has gone ahead and put theirs in place. It's helpful to hear what has worked, what has not worked in Cayman. And I keep saying that because I know a lot of times we do take our policies from other places, and so things are different in Cayman, so it helps to adapt everything to what happens here and how things play out so that it's going to be most effective. And the better first step that we can have, the better this will be in the long run. So it's really important for all of us to have a look, provide feedback, what has worked, what has not worked, and for each of us to take a step towards beginning to make the changes. Interestingly, what has the most impact is not even going to be just having this, but what studies have shown it's actually going to be something called the bystander intervention, something that we use a lot with gender violence, but it's actually having each person, as I like from Ms. Lauren's presentation, each person's responsibility in making a difference in the culture of the community and of the organization that they're a part of. So when you hear a joke, step in, say that's not okay, and shut it down and take a step and direct the conversation, the communication in a different direction. So that way it begins to communicate that we're not going to support that. That's not okay here, and it helps to build a more friendly and more supportive and more respectful culture. So it's up to each of us to make a difference with it, as well as managers training and really having the managers buy-in, which is where having input from all the different kinds of organizations, whether you're a small 4-person one, up to the ones that have hundreds, to hear what it's like for us and how this can be most helpful and the best implemented. So I'm most excited for the long-term benefits from this, but definitely encourage everyone to have a read and provide feedback so this can be as helpful as possible as we can begin to make these exciting changes that we've been looking forward to.
Thank you, Ms. Knight and Ms. Bodden for providing insight into the impact and progress on this issue of national concern. At this time, we'll go into our segment of Q&A, and I will take the opportunity of opening the floor at this time. If you have a question, I will give you the preference, and we have a lot of questions online, and so we thank you for those questions, and we will try to get to those questions. We also have a lot of questions on the floor, and we thank you and appreciate you. There is a roaming mic, and so I believe the first question is indicated from this side.
Thank you very much, and good evening. Again, I appreciate all the effort, and I'm speaking really from my former director of labor, but also a human resources. Mostly private sector, labor law, act, application. I have a couple of quick questions looking at just perusing the bill. And first of all, section or clause 7 of the bill talks about the liability of employer. I found that to be very interesting because it says an employer is liable for an act of sexual harassment committed by the employer's employees and agents only if it is proven that, and it goes on to point A and point B. What it seems to say is that if an employee conducts an act of sexual harassment in the workplace, the employer is automatically liable. I wonder why that is the case, and if there's any sanctions for that employer because an honest employer could be unknowing about this incident that's happening in the workplace, but all of a sudden, according to this bill, clause 7, that employer is liable. So I just wanted to table that question for discussion. The other thing that I noticed of interest, for those listening watching on the live stream, that was actually on page 19, I think, of the bill. There's another issue as well that I found to be of interest. And I pose this question because as a former director of labor, I don't think that the situation has changed a lot. There's always been the issue of having the time that it takes for matters to be, for a complaint to be put, for it to be assessed, for it to go to a tribunal, and these tribunals are all volunteers, and for the tribunal to actually have a hearing and issue a ruling. And so I see in this bill that on clause 25(1), it says, after a hearing, the tribunal shall, in writing. I just wondered if there was a time frame, because this could go on ad nauseum infinitum, as has happened in many cases with the existing labor tribunals when there's no time frame. And so in the case of a sexual harassment matter, the longer it drags on, the more reputational risk you have for the employer and the employee and the victim as well. So I have the question about those particular two clauses, but it also leads me to the other issue of resources. What resources are going to be available? I heard in the presentation that Ms. Bramwell mentioned that the Department of Labor and Pensions would be doing the investigations of the complaints on behalf of the Gender Equality Tribunal or agency. And I want to know whether that was feasible, because they have a full load right now, and I know they have difficulty keeping up with their workload. And also whether the volunteers in the tribunal are going to be full-time or paid, or whether they're strictly, as it is now with tribunals, people who are very busy, don't have a lot of time, and expected to come to tribunals and put in their time and generate the kind of timely work that you need. And my final point on this, and I'll step down so somebody else can speak, is what are the timelines again for investigating and for having the hearings? Because I think it's very important to define that, and I would like to suggest that the bill could be improved by putting in more specifics to take away the doubt and also to deal with issue of liability.
Thank you very much for that. Once again, it's a matter of time frame, resources allocated, as well as the volunteers being paid.
We try and get to a number of those. So in terms of the time frame, as you rightly said, for these type of matters particularly, obviously somebody could be going through all of those psychological effects while this is happening. So while the bill does not state a time frame at the moment, the best we can say is as soon as possible, but it could be something that we could improve on in the bill by putting a time frame within it. So we do take your point. But again, as you also rightly talked about in terms of the tribunal and how those are made up, yes, at this moment, it is volunteer with people who are very busy. So again, there may need to be adjustments, whether in terms of numbers of tribunal members or also, maybe down the line we'll get to the point where it has to be a structured sort of paid thing. Because in other jurisdictions, for example, it's more structured that way. And hence hearings happen quite frequently as well, depending. One of the difficulties, obviously, that we don't know at this particular moment is how many cases we are likely to get. So it's sort of a balancing act at the moment in sort of guessing what's the probability that we'll have this number of cases and hence the resources then to address them. In terms of the resources of DLP, you are correct again. We know what their sort of workload is. We found, just looking across government, that would have been one of the entities that seemed to be best suited to do these investigations. I think it's intended that there would be more staff and specially trained staff to actually do these investigations, and hence to be able to move the cases along quickly as well. So all your points are noted, and there are things obviously that it will take money to do as well.
We will take another question from the floor, but just want to remind you that we do have a frequently asked question. We have a frequently asked questions section on the website that if you want to review that first, we do have a lot of questions that are quite related to the frequently asked questions. So in the interest of time, we'll try to narrow it down to the important questions that we have here virtually. And I will take another question from the floor.
Good evening. So the one question I do have relates to what your comment, some of the feedback is, why does this not include street and public harassment? I did have a look through legislation to see what I could find that relates to sexual harassment that might cover that. And the only thing I could find that might potentially cover this would be in the penal code, which is insulting the indecency of a woman. But as you say, it's not only women who are victims, there are men. Is there any actual legislation either proposed in this or in other existing legislation that does cover sexual harassment in men, again, in public, in bars and nightclubs, etc.? And why is it not being included in this one as this does cover sexual harassment as a whole? Thank you.
In relation to sexual harassment towards men, particularly, and you mentioned the indecency of a woman in the penal code. I know that there was a conversation, consultation, etc., that the Legislative Drafting Commission, I believe, had put out about a year or so ago to perhaps change that particular phrase to make it more gender inclusive. So that is something that I assume is under consideration. Within this law, no, you're correct. Street harassment is not included. And if it was a situation where it's a employee and employee that had any sort of incident within, because there is a context of the workplace, because they have that relationship, then that can be dealt with within the workplace, but not in another sort of situation.
Thank you very much. I will take this opportunity to address some of the virtual questions that we have at this time. We do not want to leave any one of these questions out, but in the interest of time, we are looking at a question here. Will companies that already have policies that cover sexual harassment, like code of conduct, need to rewrite them according to the sample the bill provides?
That's a very good question. And we are happy to know that there are companies, we know that there are global companies, local companies who have various policies like that. And we salute them for actually taking that step and going forward with that. It will not necessarily require a total rewrite in the format. We just want to ensure that all of the things that are in that sample and are included in the law are also in the company's policy.
Here's another question, just to clarify, if the removal from schools because of the anti-bullying legislation is at the student level, they're asking the staff would still have an internal policy as an entity?
Yes.
Just to add to that, if it's a government school, that's already covered under this policy.
Okay. We have a lot of questions based on the timeline for how long the investigations into the claims will go for, and I believe that was addressed earlier. So I will take another question from the floor. Go right ahead.
Yes. That online question about educational institutions kind of segues into mine. Government schools will fall under government's policy, but we still do have tertiary level and also private schools that don't fall under government's policy, and also educational institutions that are statutory and not core government. And so my question to you is, why is it a blanket removal of all educational institutions in regards to this law applying to them, or is it just specific to government schools because you already have a policy?
Just to clarify, the points that I'm making are under consideration. It's not necessarily a done deal. As the bill is written now, it actually includes all schools, right across the board. So it's just how it is then that we decide to whether rewrite that section or remove pieces of it or what. So it's not a done deal just yet. So we take your concerns into consideration.
This may or may not have been addressed, but the question here, as jokes are often subjective, how will a person know when they have stepped into the realm of what can be considered sexual harassment?
I think the important part with that particular issue is it's the person who is experiencing the sexual harassment, the victim who basically determines or makes the other person aware that they have kind of stepped over. But I think that, I want to say common sense will tell us when we are going over that line. Obviously, some people are more aware of themselves and other person's feelings than others. But I think it's important that if there is even the remote possibility that this is seeming offensive to somebody, whether it is by how they look, how they respond back to you, etc., or what they say, then that's the time to stop.
If I may add, so I think that's where, especially in such a diverse community, it is really important to pay attention to the reactions that you're getting, because what might be considered a joke to one person could be very offensive or even scary or threatening to another. And so that's also where kind of the informal resolutions and stepping in and providing feedback can be really helpful. So if you notice that someone's not reacting in the anticipated way to the comments, maybe even if that person doesn't notice it and maybe the person experiencing it isn't in a position to speak up, if you could step in and be like, hey, I don't think that's going the way you planned, then that can be really helpful, because it does take time to figure out where the boundaries are at times.
I will squeeze one last question here. Will there be any repercussions for someone who makes a false allegation?
Yes, as I talked about in the orders that the tribunal can make, if that it has been found that the person has made a vexatious or frivolous complaint, the person can actually be charged, I think, up to $10,000 for that.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just got an indication that we are out of time, and I really tried to squeeze these questions in. Thank you for the questions, both in person and virtually and online. The Cayman Islands government will be holding several district meetings over the next 4 weeks to discuss the proposed Sexual Harassment Bill 2023. Join the conversation. Questions and feedback may also be submitted ahead of the town hall, to gender equality at gov.ky. That is, once again, gender equality at gov.ky. Thank you for watching on CIGTV and our YouTube and Facebook channels, Logic Channel 23, C3 Channel 3, and Flow Channel 106. Feedback will be gathered, analyzed, and incorporated into the draft Sexual Harassment Bill for consideration by Cabinet and gazetted in the fourth quarter of 2023. Do we have any last and final comments?
We'd just like to say thank you very much for the persons who attended today and for the questions that you have asked, have given us a lot to consider. And also for those online, we see the number of questions. Clearly this needed to be a longer session, but we're glad that there is interest in this legislation and that the public has seen the importance of it. And I'd also like to thank Lauren and Lexi for joining me this evening as well, and for adding their contributions to this. Thank you very much. Any words from you, ladies?
All right, well, thank you. Thank you once again to Ms. Caroline Bramwell, to Ms. Lauren Knight, and Ms. Alexandra Bodden for being here with us and providing this insight into this very important issue here in the Cayman Islands. Thank you to each and one of you that have been here in person and online. Until next time, I'm Shanda Gallego.